Welcome, dear listener, to another enchanting bedtime story. Tonight, as the world around you quiets and the stars twinkle softly in the sky, let your mind drift into a realm of ancient kingdoms and forgotten legends. In the heart of our tale lies a crown, powerful and mysterious, but with a story that has been whispered only in the quietest corners of the world. As you lay back and close your eyes, allow the gentle words of this tale to guide you into a peaceful slumber where dreams carry you far away. Let go of the day's worries and let the soft magic of the night embrace you. Now, let us begin our journey with the cursed crown. In the hushed corners of taverns and around flickering hearths, there is a story, old as time itself, that drifts like smoke through the air. A crown, they say, forged in the fires of an age long forgotten. It was a relic not of this world, created by hands that no longer roam the earth, hands that knew the secrets of both life and death. This crown, whispered the elders, was more than a mere symbol of power. It was power itself, power beyond comprehension, capable of bending the laws of the natural world to the will of its bearer. But it came with a price, one that consumed the soul and devoured the flesh. Few believe the tale anymore, for it belonged to the realm of myth. It was said that the last to wear the crown was a king whose name had been erased from all records. A king who vanished into the mists of history as a dragon roared across the skies one final time. The dragon had disappeared too, and with it, the cursed crown that had bestowed its terrifying transformation. But legends, like shadows, have a way of lingering, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In the kingdom of Erlendir, King Eldrin sat upon a throne carved from stone and oak, his brow furrowed as the weight of his crown, the mundane, earthly one, pressed heavy upon his temples. The kingdom, once flourishing, now crumbled around him. Famine stalked the fields, and whispers of rebellion curled through the streets like vines seeking cracks in a foundation. Eldrin was a man of honor, a ruler who had always placed his people above himself. Yet, in the stillness of night, when the weight of his failures kept him from sleep, a dark thought would flicker in his mind. Power. Power to crush his enemies. Power to rebuild his kingdom. Power to set things right. It was during one such sleepless night that a visitor arrived at court. No one knew his name, and none had seen him enter the kingdom. He appeared like a phantom, cloaked in shadow and silence, his presence a whisper on the wind. The guards let him pass without question, as if compelled by forces beyond their control. When he stepped into the great hall, his footsteps made no sound. "Eldrin, King of Erlendir," the stranger spoke, his voice soft but carrying the weight of centuries. "I have come to offer you a gift." The king, startled by the man's sudden presence, eyed him warily. "Who are you to enter my court unannounced? What is this gift you speak of?" The stranger's lips curled into a smile, though it was one devoid of warmth. I am but a messenger, a servant to the tides of fate. And the gift I bring is not mine to give, but yours to claim, a crown unlike any other, hidden away in the forgotten places of the world. A crown that once belonged to kings who ruled not with armies, but with the very forces of nature at their command. Eldrin's heart quickened, though he kept his face impassive. A crown? You speak of legends, old man. Fairy tales meant to entertain children and drunkards. Legends are often truths, buried beneath the weight of time. The stranger replied, his voice now no more than a murmur. The crown of Dracarys, they called it, for it was forged by the fires of dragons themselves. It grants its wearer strength beyond mortal means, wisdom beyond mortal minds. But it is not without a cost. The king's eyes darkened. And what cost would that be? The stranger's gaze flickered, something ancient and knowing glinting within. That, your majesty, is for you to discover. If you seek the crown, it will reveal its nature to you in time. But know this, the choice is yours. It always has been. With that, the stranger turned and melted into the shadows as silently as he had come, leaving behind an unspoken promise and a dark temptation that would haunt Eldrin's thoughts long after the candles had burned low. In the cold silence of the great hall, Eldrin sat alone, the tale of the cursed crown echoing in his mind like the distant call of a dragon. The legend had resurfaced, and with it, a choice that could not be undone. The days that followed the stranger's visit were marked by a peculiar quiet that settled over the kingdom, like the uneasy calm before a storm. King Eldrin's court, usually bustling with the noise of advisers and petitioners, was subdued. Those who came before him spoke in whispers, as though the air itself had thickened, heavy with some unseen weight. Yet none knew the reason for this change. Only Eldrin understood the shadow that now clung to the throne. The king's mind was no longer his own. By day he performed his duties, his face a mask of calm as he listened to the pleas of his people. But his thoughts strayed elsewhere, circling back to the crown of Dracarys, the stranger had called it. The mere mention of it had awakened something in him, a hunger he had not known was there, a deep and gnawing desire for more than what the mortal world could offer. At night, the temptation became unbearable. Alone in his chambers, Eldrin would sit by the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes as he imagined the power that lay waiting for him. He could almost feel it, the weight of the crown upon his brow, the surge of strength coursing through his veins. The world would bow before him, and his enemies would tremble. His kingdom, now fragile and teetering on the edge of collapse, would rise from the ashes, glorious and indomitable. But always, in the darkest corner of his mind, a voice whispered warnings. The crown was cursed. its power entwined with something far older and more dangerous than any magic Eldrin had ever encountered. And the price, the stranger had said, was one he would discover in time. One night, as the moon hung low and full in the sky, Eldrin found himself pacing the length of his chambers. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a rhythmic beat that matched the quickening of his heart. He could no longer resist the pull. The crown called to him, its lure insistent and unyielding. "I must have it," he murmured to the empty room, though the words felt foreign on his lips, as if spoken by some unseen force through him. "I must wear the crown." Eldrin summoned his most trusted advisor, Lord Calen, a man who had served the royal family for years. Calen entered the chamber, his brow furrowed in concern. The king had not been himself lately, and though no one dared speak of it openly, the court had noticed the change. "My king," Calen began, bowing low, "you called for me." Eldrin turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that Calen had never seen before. "I have made a decision. The kingdom is faltering, and I cannot allow it to fall. We need power, more than we possess now. There is an ancient crown, hidden deep within the mountains, one that could give us the strength to restore Erlendir. I must find it." Calen's face paled. "The crown of Dracarys, my lord? You cannot be serious. That crown is nothing more than a legend, a cursed artifact from stories long past. No good has ever come from such things." Eldrin's gaze hardened. "You think me a fool, Calen. I have heard the stories, but this crown is real. It is out there, waiting for me. I can feel it. And with its power, we could save our people." "My king," Calen said softly, stepping closer, "the legends warn of the crown's curse. It is said that it corrupts all who wear it. Please reconsider. Your rule has been just. Do not let ambition lead you astray." But Eldrin's mind was set. The temptation had already burrowed too deep. He dismissed Calen with a wave of his hand. "Prepare the horses. We leave at first light. I will find the crown, and I will save this kingdom." Calen bowed again, though his reluctance was evident in every movement. "As you wish, my king." As the door closed behind him, Eldrin turned back to the fire, its light casting long shadows on the stone walls. He felt a thrill rise within him, something akin to triumph, though it was laced with a darkness he chose to ignore. The crown was within his grasp now, and the kingdom would soon be his to reshape. But outside, the night winds howled, carrying with them the faintest echo of a dragon's roar. The journey to the mountains of the north was long and perilous. Eldrin rode at the head of his small company, their horses cutting a path through the dense fog that clung to the land like a living thing. The trees were ancient here, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air grew colder with every step they took. No birds sang in this desolate place. and the only sound was the crunch of frost beneath their feet. Yet, despite the bitter chill, a strange heat stirred within Eldrin, a pulse of anticipation that quickened with each mile. For days, they travelled in near silence, the men behind Eldrin casting uneasy glances at the mountains that loomed ahead. The peaks were jagged and cruel, as though the earth itself had been torn open and left to bleed. The villagers from nearby towns had whispered of these mountains for centuries. They called them cursed, forsaken by the gods. But Eldrin paid them no heed. His thoughts were consumed by the promise of the crown, a promise that thrummed louder with every step. On the 5th night, they reached the base of the mountains. The sky was an iron grey, the clouds swollen with the threat of snow. But Eldrin saw none of it. His eyes were fixed on the narrow path that wound up into the cliffs, a path that, if the stranger's words were true, would lead him to the crown's resting place. Without hesitation, he dismounted, leaving his men behind with little more than a curt order to make camp. "Are you sure about this, my lord?" Kaelin asked, his voice low as he approached the king. His face was drawn, worry etched deep into the lines around his eyes. "These mountains are not safe. Whatever lies within them, it may be more than you bargained for." Eldrin gave him a hard look. "I have come too far to turn back now, Kaelin. The crown is mine to claim. Wait here until I return." Before his advisor could respond, Eldrin began his ascent, his cloak billowing behind him like a shadow. The path grew steeper as he climbed, the air thinning and sharp with cold. But still, Eldrin pressed on, driven by a force he could no longer name. He could feel it now, something ahead, just beyond his reach. The crown was calling to him, its pull growing stronger with every step. At last, after what felt like hours, Eldrin reached the mouth of a cave. The entrance was framed by jagged rocks, and within, an unnatural glow emanated from the depths, casting faint, flickering light on the cavern walls. The very air seemed to hum with the presence of ancient magic, and for the first time, Eldrin hesitated. The glow was not warm. It was cold, sharp, and unnatural, like the dying embers of a star. Something deep within the cave pulsed with energy, sending ripples through the stillness, and Eldrin's heart pounded in response. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The cave's interior was vast, larger than it seemed from the outside. And the deeper he ventured, the more the light intensified. Soon, the walls were bathed in the eerie glow, and the very stones beneath his feet seemed to throb with life. Eldrin's breath quickened, his skin prickling with the strange energy in the air. Then he saw it. At the center of the cavern stood a stone pedestal, its surface worn smooth by time, and upon it rested the crown. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The golden band shimmered as though it was made from molten light, its surface etched with symbols too ancient to decipher. spires of dark metal twisted upward from its base, resembling the horns of a great beast. And at the center, a single jewel burned with a fire that seemed to pulse in time with Eldrin's racing heart. He approached it slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There it was, the crown of Dracarys, the object of his desire, the key to his kingdom's salvation. But as his fingers reached for it, the shadows around him seemed to deepen, and for the briefest of moments, Eldrin thought he saw movement, something shifting just beyond the edge of the light. A voice, ancient and cold, whispered in his mind, "Power comes with a price." But the warning, faint and distant, faded as his hand closed around the crown. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy exploded through him. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. Fire and ice, light and darkness, all colliding in a storm that roared through his veins. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world seemed to spin. Then, just as quickly, the sensation faded, leaving him breathless and trembling. Eldrin placed the crown upon his head. The world seemed to shift around him. Colors sharpened, sounds grew louder, and the very air itself trembled at his presence. He could feel it now, the power, the unimaginable strength that had been promised to him. It was intoxicating. But as he stood there, bathed in the unearthly glow, something cold brushed against his skin, and a sharp pain seared across the back of his hand. Eldrin looked down. A single, glistening scale had formed on his wrist. Eldrin returned to the kingdom a changed man. The moment he crossed the threshold of the castle gates, those who saw him felt it. A shift in the air, a crackling energy that seemed to hum around their king like an invisible storm. His eyes, once shadowed by the weight of doubt and failure, now burned with a brilliance that left those in his presence speechless. His movements were sharp, deliberate, as though every step he took commanded the very ground beneath him. The crown, the cursed crown, sat atop his brow, gleaming with an unnatural light that flickered in the dark corners of the throne room. No one dared to question its origins, though whispers rippled through the court like ripples on a still pond. The king had gone in search of something ancient and powerful, and he had returned with more than anyone could have imagined. Under Eldrin's rule, the kingdom of Erlendir began to change. His decrees were swift and absolute, met with no opposition. Those who had once plotted rebellion now bowed in submission, their voices silenced by a force they could not explain. The land itself seemed to thrive. Crops grew faster, richer, and the rivers swelled with fresh, clear water. The people spoke of Eldrin with awe, some even daring to believe he had been touched by the gods. The king, they said, had been reborn. Yet, amidst the praise, something darker stirred beneath the surface. In the quiet of his chambers, Eldrin would stare into the mirror, his reflection no longer entirely his own. His eyes, once a clear blue, had begun to shift, their hue darkening to a molten gold. His breath, when he slept, came in slow, deep exhalations that carried a faint trace of smoke. The single scale that had appeared on his wrist the night he claimed the crown had begun to spread. Small patches of glistening scales now crept along his forearms, hidden beneath the fabric of his sleeves. But it was his mind that troubled him the most. In his dreams, Eldrin found himself standing at the edge of a vast, desolate landscape. Mountains, jagged and black as obsidian, rose into a sky that bled with the colors of dusk and fire. A shadow moved at the horizon, a great winged creature, its silhouette vast and terrible against the dying light. As it approached, its eyes gleamed with a cold, ancient intelligence, and its voice echoed in his mind, a low, guttural whisper. You are becoming. You are mine. Each time, Eldrin would wake drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He could still feel the heat of the dragon's breath against his skin, and the weight of its presence lingered long after the dream had faded. The crown had granted him the power he so desperately sought, but it had awakened something else within him, something far more dangerous. But during the day, those dark thoughts were swept aside. Eldrin's rule had become ironclad, and his enemies fell before him like leaves in a storm. Neighbouring kingdoms, long at odds with Erlendir, sent envoys begging for peace. Trade flourished, and the people, his people, believed their king to be invincible. Yet the queen, Alyra, was not blind to the changes in her husband. She watched him from a distance, her heart heavy with a quiet fear she dared not voice. In the early mornings, when the castle was still, she would find him standing on the balcony, staring out at the horizon with a gaze that seemed far too distant, far too other. Something is wrong, she whispered to herself one evening, watching as Eldrin descended into the grand hall. His steps were lighter than they should be, almost as though he floated above the ground. The crown has changed him. That night, Alyra sought out Kaelin, the king's closest advisor, who had shared her concerns from the moment Eldrin returned with the crown. They met in the shadowed corners of the castle, their voices hushed as they spoke of the king's transformation. He is not the man he once was, Kaelin murmured, his eyes darting around as though the very walls had ears. The power the crown has given him is unnatural. It is changing him, and not for the better. Alyra nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. We must find a way to help him, Kaelin, before it's too late. But even as they spoke, they both knew the truth. The crown's power was too great, too ancient. Whatever force had bound itself to Eldrin would not be easily undone. As the night deepened and shadows thickened in the corners of the castle, Eldrin sat alone on his throne, the crown pulsing faintly with its eerie glow. His hand, now partially covered in dragon scales, flexed unconsciously, and a faint curl of smoke drifted from his lips as he exhaled. He could feel it deep within him, the beast stirring, the dragon awakening. The moon hung low over Erlendir that night, its pale light casting long, twisted shadows across the castle walls. A heavy silence filled the air, the kind that comes before a storm. Within the grand chambers of the king, the night was anything but still. Alyra stirred from her sleep, her breath quickening as the cold, empty space beside her reminded her of her husband's absence. Eldrin had not slept beside her for many nights now, often vanishing into the deep hours when sleep should claim him. There were whispers among the servants, murmurs of the king, walking through the castle like a man haunted, his eyes gleaming with a golden light that flickered like the dying embers of a fire. Unable to ignore the dread that had settled like a stone in her chest, Alyra rose from the bed and slipped through the dim halls of the castle, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floors. She followed the faint glow she saw seeping from beneath the heavy wooden doors of the king's private chamber. She hesitated only for a moment before pushing them open. Eldrin stood in the center of the room, bathed in a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse from the crown atop his head. His back was to her, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each labored breath. And in the quiet, Alyra could hear a low, guttural sound, a sound that was not entirely human. Eldrin? She called softly, her voice trembling in the darkness. He did not turn, but the light around him flickered. And in that moment, Alyra saw it. His hands, once those of a man, were now something else entirely. Dark scales glistened along his skin, creeping up from his wrists to his elbows. His fingers, elongated and twisted, ended in sharp claws that reflected the eerie glow of the crown. "Stay back!" Eldrin growled, his voice deeper, rougher than she had ever heard it before. "You should not have come here." But Alyra took a step forward, her heart aching as she looked upon the man she loved, the man who was no longer wholly himself. "Eldrin, what is happening to you? What has the crown done?" Finally, he turned to face her, and Alyra gasped. His eyes, once the clear blue of a summer sky, had fully transformed. They were now molten gold, burning with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. His skin, once smooth and warm, was marked by patches of rough, scaly texture, and his breath came in short bursts, each exhale carrying a faint plume of smoke. "I can feel it," he rasped, his voice laced with something wild. "It's inside me, Alyra. The crown. It's changing me. He paused, clenching his fists as the scales crept further up his arms, disappearing beneath the sleeves of his tunic. "I cannot stop it." Tears welled in Alyra's eyes as she reached out to him, but Eldrin recoiled, stepping back as though her touch would only quicken his unraveling. I thought I could control it, he said, his voice breaking. The fierce king reduced to a man teetering on the edge of despair. I thought the power would be mine alone, but now it's consuming me. The crown is alive, Alyra. It whispers to me. It speaks of the dragon, the one whose spirit resides within the metal. And every day I become less of the man I was. Every day I become more of the beast. Alyra's heart clenched at the sight of her husband, his once strong hands now trembling, caught in the throes of the curse. "We'll find a way to stop it," she whispered, though her words felt hollow even to her own ears. "We'll find a way to remove the crown. There must be a way." But Eldrin shook his head, a grim smile pulling at his lips. "The crown cannot be removed. It has fused with me, bound itself to my very soul. To remove it would mean..." His voice trailed off, and the meaning of his words hung heavy between them. The crown could not be taken from him without claiming his life. Alyra stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his arm, feeling the rough texture of scales beneath her fingers. She held back a sob. "Then we will find another way. I won't lose you to this. We still have time." But deep down, they both knew the truth. The transformation had already begun, and time was slipping through their fingers like sand. The man who stood before her, though still Eldrin in form, was no longer fully human. He was becoming something else, something far older, far more dangerous. As Alyra stood there, her heart breaking, a low rumble escaped Eldrin's throat, the sound so deep it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the castle. His eyes closed, and when they opened again, there was a glint of something wild in them, something ancient and untamable. "Leave," he growled, his voice almost unrecognizable, "before it's too late." But Alyra stood firm, refusing to move. "I will not leave you." The king's jaw tightened, and his breath came in short, labored bursts. The dragon was stirring, awakening from its long slumber, and with each passing moment, it claimed more of him. But even as the beast rose within him, Eldrin clung to the last shred of his humanity, fighting against the tide. For now, the night in Erlendir grew darker as winter tightened its grip, and within the castle, so too did the shadows deepen around the throne. Eldrin, once revered as a king of great wisdom, now walked the halls like a haunted man, his every step echoing with the weight of a curse he could no longer deny. His people still revered him, still whispered of his newfound strength, but they did not see what Alyra saw, the quiet madness lurking beneath his gilded crown. It was no longer a matter of if, but when. The changes came slowly at first, creeping like the frost over the windows each morning. Eldrin's temper, once measured and calm, became unpredictable, his anger flaring at the slightest provocation. The court trembled before him, his advisors careful to choose their words lest they invoke his wrath. Even Kaelin, his most trusted friend, now approached him with unease, aware that the king's once steady gaze had taken on the feral glint of a predator watching its prey. But it wasn't only his temper that frightened those around him. Eldrin's body had begun to change in ways that could no longer be hidden beneath royal robes and armor. His shoulders had broadened unnaturally, and beneath his skin, strange, sinewy muscles twisted and coiled like something foreign. His hands, once the hands of a king, were now gnarled and clawed, the scales creeping higher each day. In the quiet of the night, Alyra would watch him from the shadows, her heart heavy with dread. She had tried to speak with him, tried to remind him of the man he had once been, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The crown, that cursed crown, had taken root in his mind, whispering to him in the dark, turning his thoughts against her. He no longer looked at her with the warmth of a husband. There was something colder in his gaze now, something far more dangerous. One night, as the castle lay still beneath a sky thick with snow, the transformation took a darker turn. Alyra awoke to the sound of distant crashing, the ground trembling beneath her bed. She rose quickly, pulling her cloak tight around her shoulders as she hurried through the halls. The closer she came to Eldrin's chambers, the louder the sounds became, furniture splintering, the roar of fire crackling through stone. And amidst it all, a low, guttural growl that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the handle. Something told her that whatever lay beyond that door was no longer her husband. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The scene within the chamber was one of chaos. The grand tapestries that once hung from the walls had been torn to shreds, and the large oaken table lay in splinters at Eldrin's feet. Flames licked at the edges of the stone hearth, casting wild, flickering shadows across the room. But it was Eldrin himself who held her gaze. No longer a man, but something between man and beast. His back was to her, his body hunched, the thick scales now covering much of his skin. His once dark hair had grown wild, streaked with silver and gold, and his hands, those claws, were blackened and sharp, leaving deep gouges in the stone floor. His breath came in ragged gasps, and with each exhale, a thin plume of smoke curled from his nostrils. "Eldrin," Alyra whispered, her voice breaking. He did not turn. Instead, a deep growl rumbled through his chest, the sound resonating in the very walls around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "I cannot control it. It's too late." "No," Alyra said, stepping closer, though her heart pounded in her chest. "It's not too late. We can still—" A violent roar cut her off, the sound deafening as it tore from Eldrin's throat. His body convulsed, and in a blur of movement, he turned to face her, his eyes glowing with a fierce, animalistic light. There was no recognition in them, only hunger, only rage. "I am losing myself," he hissed, his voice somewhere between a man's and a beast's. "The dragon, it is waking." Before she could speak, Eldrin moved, faster than she thought possible, hurling the remnants of a chair across the room with a strength that sent it shattering against the far wall. His breathing grew heavier, more laboured, as if he were fighting some unseen force within. But the scales, the claws, the fire, they were all signs that the battle was being lost. Alyra took a step back, tears streaming down her face. "Eldrin, please." For a moment he faltered. His eyes flickered, and beneath the golden glow she saw a flash of the man she had once loved. The king who had ruled with justice and compassion. But it was only a flicker. "I cannot stop it," he whispered, his voice trembling with despair. The crown will make me a monster." In that moment, as Eldrin collapsed to his knees, a single tear slipped from his eye, mingling with the smoke that curled from his lips. He looked up at her one last time, his voice a ragged plea. "Save me, before I am no longer myself." Alyra had always known there was a cost. But as she rode through the frozen valleys toward the haunted mountains, she understood that the price was far greater than she could have imagined. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, and the biting cold stung her skin, but none of it mattered. The words of the seer echoed in her mind, repeating over and over like a curse bound to her very soul. The crown was not forged for a king, but for a god. It had taken all of her courage to leave Eldrin. He had pleaded for her to stay, his voice breaking as the dragon's grip tightened. But she knew that time was slipping away, and with each passing moment, the man she loved was being devoured by the beast that lay dormant within the crown. If there was any hope of saving him, it lay within the ancient mountains where the crown had first been forged. The path grew narrower as Alyra ascended, the terrain more treacherous with each step. The very air seemed to hum with dark magic, as though the mountains themselves were alive, watching, waiting. She could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, but there was no turning back. Not now. Not when Eldrin's life, his very soul, hung in the balance. The entrance to the cave was barely visible, hidden beneath a veil of frost and stone. Yet, as Alyra approached, a faint light flickered within, pulsing like a heartbeat. She dismounted and approached cautiously, her breath visible in the frigid air. She knew what waited for her within, for the stories had warned her. This was the place where gods once walked, where the lines between man and monster blurred, and where the crown was born. Inside the cave, the temperature seemed to drop even further, though a soft, eerie glow illuminated the stone walls. The light came from the heart of the cave, from the very place where Eldrin had once stood and taken the crown. The same energy that had once called to him now pulled at her, guiding her deeper into the darkness. She moved carefully, her footsteps echoing faintly against the stone. And then she saw him. The figure was not human, not entirely. He sat in the center of the cave, his body wrapped in robes that seemed woven from shadow and light, his skin pale as moonlight. His eyes, though closed, glowed with a soft golden radiance, and his breath came in slow, deliberate rhythms, as though the passing of time itself was but a distant memory to him. This was one of the forgotten ones, a remnant of the beings who had forged the crown, a creature older than the earth, older than the stars. You seek answers, his voice came soft and cold, as if he had already known of her arrival long before she entered the cave. But answers are seldom what one desires when the truth is revealed. Alyra froze. The figure did not stir, though his voice resonated through the cavern like the toll of a distant bell. "I seek to save my husband," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The crown is destroying him. Tell me how to stop it." At this, the figure's eyes opened, glowing orbs of gold that bore into her very soul. "Your husband wears the crown of Dracarys, a relic not meant for mortal hands. The crown was created for a god, a being far beyond the realm of man. Its power is infinite, yes, but it cannot be contained by flesh and blood. The moment he placed it upon his head, he began the transformation, not into a king, but into a beast, into the dragon that resides within the crown's very essence." Alyra's heart pounded in her chest. "Then tell me how to break the curse. There must be a way." The figure smiled, though the gesture was without warmth. "There is always a way. But the cost, Queen, is beyond anything you can imagine. The crown and its wearer are now bound. To break the curse is to sever that bond, but the bond is made of life itself. One cannot exist without the other." Alyra felt the weight of the words settle over her like a shroud. "You're telling me that to break the curse, Eldrin must die?" The figure nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "The crown cannot be removed without destroying its host. The transformation is irreversible. If the crown is to be taken from him, he will cease to be. There is no other path." The truth struck Alyra like a blow, and for a moment she could not breathe. She had come seeking hope, a way to save her husband, but the truth was far darker than she had anticipated. The only way to free Eldrin from the dragon's curse was to end his life. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of her decision pressed down on her. She had fought so hard to save him, to find a way to undo the curse. But now she stood on the precipice of an impossible choice. Could she end the life of the man she loved to save him from the beast he was becoming? The figure stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed a hand upon her shoulder. "The choice is yours, Queen of Erlendir. But know this. Once the crown is claimed, it cannot be returned. The dragon within it will rise again, and the next to wear it will face the same fate. You may save him from his curse, but you cannot save the crown from itself. Alyra swallowed the sob that threatened to escape her throat and nodded, her heart breaking beneath the weight of her decision. She knew what she had to do. She would not let Eldrin become the dragon. The castle of Erlendir loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the pale light of dawn. Alyra stood at the edge of the forest, her heart heavy with the knowledge she carried, the weight of the decision that awaited her. She had returned from the haunted mountains, but the journey ahead felt far more perilous. The truth had been laid bare before her, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. She knew what had to be done, yet every step toward the castle felt like a betrayal of the man she had loved. The air was thick with the silence of mourning, and though the world around her stirred with the faint sounds of life, birds, the rustle of leaves, within her there was only the unbearable quiet of dread. The curse could only be broken by death. The crown could only be removed if Eldrin's life was severed from it. To save him from becoming the dragon, she would have to kill him. As Alyra approached the gates of the castle, her mind wandered to the man Eldrin had once been, the king who had loved his people, who had ruled with compassion, wisdom, and justice. His laughter, once a balm to her troubled heart, was now a distant memory, replaced by the low growl of the dragon that had taken hold of him. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way his body twisted and changed, in the way his voice had become a beast's. The guards at the gate bowed as she passed, but their faces were clouded with unease. The whispers had grown louder within the castle, rumours of the king's condition spreading like wildfire. No one dared speak the full truth, but the fear was there, simmering beneath the surface. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with tension. The courtiers who once had gathered in the light of the king's presence now stood in uneasy silence, their eyes darting toward the closed doors of Eldrin's private chamber. No one entered without permission, and none had seen the king for days. Alyra did not hesitate. She moved with purpose, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the door. Her fingers grazed the cold wood, her breath catching as she prepared herself for what awaited on the other side. She could feel the weight of the crown's magic pulsing through the walls, a dark energy that radiated from within, suffocating and alive. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Eldrin sat upon his throne, the crown still gleaming upon his brow. His once proud figure was now hunched, his body nearly fully transformed. Scales glistened in the dim light, covering his arms and chest, his hands ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped at the stone beneath him. His eyes, those eyes she had once loved, were now molten gold, glowing with an intensity that made her heart ache. But there was something else in those eyes too, something fragile, something human. It flickered faintly, like a candle struggling to remain lit in a storm. "Eldrin?" she whispered, stepping forward, her voice trembling. He raised his head slowly, his breath ragged, the dragon's presence clear in every movement. Smoke curled from his lips as he exhaled, his gaze locking onto her with a hunger that both terrified and saddened her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was thick with the weight of all that had been lost. "You came back," he rasped, his voice a guttural mix of man and beast. "Why?" Alyra swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to remain steady. "I came back because I love you, and because I know what must be done." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "You know the truth, then? You know there is no saving me." She nodded, her heart breaking with each passing second. "Yes, the crown's curse. It cannot be undone, not while you live." Eldrin closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his features. "I thought I could control it. I thought the power would be mine, that I could wield it without consequence. But the dragon, it is stronger than me, Alyra. It is devouring me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. She could not afford to break, not now. "There is still time to stop it. I can end this. I can stop the transformation before it's too late. But you have to let me." He opened his eyes again, and for a moment, she saw the man she loved. The man who had once held her in his arms, who had promised to protect her and their kingdom. But there was also something else in his gaze, acceptance. "I know," he whispered. "I've known for days, but I couldn't. I couldn't ask you to do it." Alyra stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the cool scales. "I will not let you become the dragon, Eldrin. I will not let the crown take you from me." His breath hitched, and for the first time in days, a tear slipped from his golden eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking, "for everything." With a soft sob, Alyra leaned forward and kissed his brow, her lips brushing against the cold metal of the crown. "I love you," she whispered, "always." In that moment, Eldrin closed his eyes, and the last remnants of the man he had once been slipped away, leaving only the shadow of what he had become. Alyra, her heart heavy with the weight of her choice, stepped back and drew the dagger she had hidden beneath her cloak. The blade gleamed in the dim light, sharp and unyielding. With one final breath, she drove the blade into his chest. The chamber was silent, but for the sound of Eldrin's final breath. The moment the blade pierced his heart, the room seemed to shudder, as if the very walls mourned the king's passing. Alyra stood frozen, her hand still wrapped around the hilt of the dagger, her eyes locked on his face. His golden eyes, now dimming, slowly closed, and the soft rise and fall of his chest ceased. For a long moment, there was nothing but stillness. The crown, once so alive with power, now lay upon the cold stone floor, its once blazing glow fading into a dull shimmer. It no longer thrummed with energy, no longer whispered promises of dominion and strength. It was just a crown, lifeless and cold, an artifact of a forgotten age. Alyra's hand slipped from the dagger and she staggered back, her knees giving way beneath her. The room seemed to spin, and a deep, guttural sob tore from her throat as she collapsed beside Eldrin's still form. Her hands shook as she reached for him, pulling him into her arms, cradling his head against her chest. The man she had loved was gone, taken by the curse of the crown, by the greed and ambition that had clouded his heart. She had come to save him, but in the end, it was she who had taken his life. The weight of that truth crushed her, and for a long while, she could do nothing but weep, the tears falling freely onto his dark, tangled hair. Outside, the sun began to rise, its pale light filtering through the narrow windows of the chamber, casting a golden glow over the scene. The kingdom of Erlendir, unaware of the sacrifice that had been made, stirred beneath the morning light, its people going about their lives as if nothing had changed. But for Alyra, everything had changed. She stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding Eldrin close, her heart breaking anew with every beat. The world outside the walls of the castle seemed distant, unreal. Only the man in her arms mattered, and the silence that now filled the room, a silence that would never be broken again. At last, when her tears had run dry and her body ached with grief, she lifted her head and looked down at the crown lying beside them. It shimmered faintly in the soft light, its dark spires twisting upward like the horns of the dragon it had awakened. For a moment, she felt a surge of hatred for the crown, for the curse that had taken her husband from her, for the gods who had allowed such a thing to exist. But then the hatred passed, replaced by a hollow emptiness. The crown was not the true villain. It was simply a tool, an object forged by hands long forgotten, imbued with power beyond mortal understanding. It had done what it was created to do, and now it waited, patient and cold, for the next soul to claim it. With trembling hands, Alyra reached out and took hold of the crown. It was surprisingly light, its metal cool against her skin. She stood slowly, cradling the crown in her hands, and looked down at Eldrin one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet. "I'm so sorry." Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked toward the door, the crown held tightly in her grasp. The weight of it, though light in her hands, pressed heavily upon her heart. She knew what she had to do. The crown could not remain in the world of men. Its power was too great, its curse too dangerous. It had to be hidden, buried where no one would ever find it. She descended the stairs of the castle in a daze, the crown tucked beneath her cloak. The servants who passed her in the hall gave her curious glances, but none dared speak. They could sense the grief that clung to her, the sorrow that radiated from her every step. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting a warm glow over the castle grounds. Alyra made her way to the ancient forest beyond the walls, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the trees grew tall and thick, their roots winding deep into the earth. It was there, beneath the twisted boughs of the forest, that she would lay the crown to rest. She knelt at the base of an ancient oak, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. With her bare hands, she dug into the earth, the cold soil biting at her fingers. But she did not stop. She dug until the ground gave way, until there was a hole deep enough to hold the crown. And then, with trembling hands, she placed it inside. As she covered the crown with dirt, a strange stillness settled over the forest, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When at last the crown was buried, Alyra stood, her hands dirty and trembling, and she whispered a final prayer to the gods. Let this curse end here. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying her words away, and Alyra turned her back on the burial site, walking slowly back toward the castle. Behind her, the crown lay hidden beneath the earth, waiting for the day when it would be found again. But for now, the curse slept, and the dragon's last breath had finally faded into silence. The crown is buried, its curse momentarily subdued, but the legend of its power lingers in the shadows. Though Eldrin's life has ended, the tale of the crown of Dracarys remains, a warning to those who seek power beyond mortal bounds. Alyra returns to the kingdom, carrying the weight of her choice, knowing that the world has been forever changed, and the dragon waits for the next soul to rise.